A nameless suitcase. No sender, no clues. Until Holmes opened it. Welcome to Grey Whisper. I am your host, Silas Drex. Let's grow this mystery-loving community. Comment where you're watching from. Your presence makes every case unforgettable. Let's begin. It was on a particularly drab February morning in the year 1895 that I found myself once again seated opposite Sherlock Holmes in our lodgings at 221B Baker Street. A fire smouldered dutifully in the hearth, though the chill of London's rain still managed to slither through the panes and coil about the ankles. Holmes, with his usual disregard for such earthly discomforts, was seated cross-legged upon the settee, his eyes half-closed and fingers pressed together beneath his chin in that peculiar pose which always signaled the brooding onset of deduction. I had been perusing the morning edition of The Times, idly remarking on a dispute over South African diamonds, when our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, knocked once and entered with a peculiar stiffness to her gait. "A delivery, sir," she said, placing a battered leather suitcase in the center of the Persian rug. No note. No messenger. Just this. Holmes opened his eyes slowly. He did not rise. "No name?" he asked. "None, Mr. Holmes. It was just there, left upon the doorstep when I answered the bell." The boy who rang it had already vanished into the fog. I saw no face. Holmes uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, his eyes suddenly sharp and animated. "A suitcase," he murmured, as if to himself. "An anonymous object of travel, delivered not to a man, but to a place. Curious." I stood and approached it. The suitcase was ordinary in construction, brown leather, iron clasps, worn edges. But its very ordinariness seemed to carry an unsettling weight. Holmes knelt beside it, brushing his long fingers along the seams. "Watson, would you be so good as to close the curtains? The light from the window will interfere." I did as he asked, plunging the room into a muted gray. Holmes produced a small lens from his robe pocket and began examining the suitcase with minute care, as if it were a corpse. "No dust," he muttered. "Wiped recently. The leather is damp. Recent exposure to the rain, but only partially. Notice how the underside remains dry. It did not sit in the street for long." He reached for a small blade and gently pried open the clasp. The suitcase clicked. We both stood in silence for a moment before he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of crumpled newspaper, was a velvet-lined interior. At the center lay a single object. A woman's glove, ivory-colored, finely stitched, and a small envelope tucked beneath it. Holmes lifted the glove delicately, inhaling its faint perfume. "Lilac," he murmured. "Unusual for February. French-made by the stitching. Left hand only." He turned to the envelope. It was unmarked. No address, no seal. Merely folded once and closed with an ordinary paper clip. He opened it, scanned the contents, and passed it silently to me. The message was written in hurried, slanted ink. "You do not know me, Mr. Holmes, but I beg you. Do not open what lies beneath the glove. If you do, another life will be lost. I have done all I can. A friend." I glanced at Holmes. He was already peering into the suitcase again, lifting the velvet lining gently to reveal a hollowed compartment beneath. Within that space, tucked in a tight corner, was a small brass key and what looked to be a torn piece of a railway ticket. No more than a fragment. A woman's glove, a veiled warning, a key to something unseen, and the remains of travel, Holmes said almost cheerfully. "This, my dear Watson, is not merely a puzzle. It is a performance. Someone has gone to great lengths to orchestrate our interest. You intend to take the case, then?" "My dear fellow," he said, rising to his feet, "the case has taken us, and I dare say we must discover where this suitcase was meant to arrive before someone else does." He strode to the window and pulled aside the curtain, looking out into the drifting fog of Baker Street. "Fetch your coat, Watson. The game, it seems, has arrived at our doorstep." Holmes did not speak for several minutes after drawing the curtain closed again. He stood motionless by the window, his sharp profile outlined by the fog-diffused light beyond the glass, and I knew better than to disturb him. The brass key, the glove, the torn railway ticket, and the ominous note. Each detail demanded contemplation, and I could see the machinery of Holmes's mind already at work, sorting, rejecting, prioritizing. He turned at last, eyes alight with purpose. "Watson," he said briskly, "there are 4 possible origins for an unmarked suitcase arriving at this address. It was meant for me, it was meant for someone else at this address, it was misdelivered, or it was never intended for delivery at all, but rather discovery. The glove and the note suggest deliberate placement, not accident. Therefore, we are being drawn into a narrative. Someone requires our attention without seeking our acquaintance." He crossed to his desk and retrieved his railway directory. Flipping through with long, precise fingers, he came to rest on a folded map of the London and South Western Railway. "The torn ticket is from this line," he muttered. Ink traces on the reverse suggest a cancelled journey, likely torn upon departure or arrival. We shall determine its station of origin, but that may take some effort. "And the glove?" I prompted. Holmes lifted the ivory item once more and held it against the light. "Left-hand glove, size 6.5. Too small for most working-class women. The embroidery at the cuff is subtly distinctive. I believe we shall find it was tailored by Duvillard and Company of Regent Street. They cater almost exclusively to women of the higher artistic or diplomatic circles." He turned the glove inside out delicately, and I caught a flash of something tucked within its lining. "Ah," Holmes murmured. "We are not the only ones capable of concealing compartments." He produced a tiny scrap of paper, no larger than a postage stamp, on which a series of numbers had been jotted in pencil. 4739, L.O., Tuesday. Holmes studied it with a mild frown. The numerals might refer to a locker. L.O. could be left luggage office, and Tuesday, perhaps a meeting or the deadline for whatever mischief is afoot. He folded the scrap and slipped it into his pocket. Then, with swift motion, he removed the velvet insert from the suitcase entirely and examined the false bottom more thoroughly. "No manufacturer's stamp," he noted. "Custom alteration. Whoever constructed this compartment intended for it to remain hidden for precisely as long as necessary, but no longer. The presence of the note suggests urgency, but also control. Our anonymous friend knew we would open it, despite the warning. It was, I suspect, a test." I found myself growing uneasy. "Holmes, you believe we were meant to violate the warning?" He smiled faintly. "No one who leaves a clue within arm's reach of a man like me expects restraint, Watson. They anticipated curiosity." There came a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered again, this time with a card in her hand. "Another visitor, Mr. Holmes, a gentleman in some distress." Holmes took the card and studied it, his eyes narrowing. "Lord Trowbridge," he said softly. "The Minister of Trade." I started. "A government minister. What could bring him here, and at this hour?" "We shall ask him," Holmes said simply, and motioned for Mrs. Hudson to admit the guest. The man who entered was tall, silver-haired, with the gaunt expression of one who had not slept for several nights. His dark eyes swept across the room as if expecting to find an ambush behind the furniture. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a strained voice, "I have been told you are the only man who can assist me. But I come not for myself, you understand?" "I understand only what I observe, Lord Trowbridge," Holmes replied evenly. "Please sit." The minister did so, and after a brief pause, leaned forward with a conspiratorial air. "My niece, Charlotte, has disappeared." 3 days ago. Holmes said nothing. He merely inclined his head. "She resides in Knightsbridge, under the supervision of her companion, a Mrs. Endicott. On Sunday morning, Charlotte rose early, dressed with care, and left the house. She did not inform anyone of her destination. She has not returned. No ransom has been demanded. No witnesses have come forward. The police? Well, you can imagine their efficacy. Holmes steepled his fingers. Charlotte Trowbridge. Age? 24. Independent, spirited. She had recently returned from Paris. Paris? Holmes's voice quickened slightly. Did she travel alone? With her maid, who has since returned? The maid claims Miss Trowbridge parted company at the station, intending to stay with an acquaintance in Belgravia. And you do not believe her? I believe the maid, Mr. Holmes. It is Charlotte's acquaintance I question. Holmes nodded slowly. Have you been to her lodgings? We have searched them thoroughly. Her belongings are untouched. The only item missing is a single piece of luggage. A suitcase, Holmes said. Lord Trowbridge sat bolt upright. Yes. How did you... But Holmes was already rising. He fetched the glove from the table and placed it in the minister's hand. Does this belong to your niece? Trowbridge's expression shifted from tension to astonishment, then something near to dread. Yes, I purchased the pair myself in Paris last winter. Then we are already entangled in her mystery, Holmes said. She has sent us a signal, and a perilous one at that. Tell me, does she possess any musical talents? The question appeared to confuse the minister. She plays the cello, if that is relevant. Every detail is relevant, Holmes murmured. He turned to me. Watson, ready yourself. We must pay a visit to Regent Street. Afterward, we shall inquire at the Waterloo Station luggage office. I suspect we may find something left behind for us, or for someone else who has not yet arrived. Lord Trowbridge stood slowly. You believe she's in danger? Holmes hesitated. I believe she is either a victim or an architect. The distinction grows thinner by the hour. The minister departed with a heavy heart, and I fetched my coat as Holmes donned his long grey overcoat and deerstalker. Before leaving, he handed me the brass key. Guard it carefully, he said. Its lock, when we find it, will open far more than a compartment. Outside, the streets of London were slick with recent rain. The fog still coiled low along the pavements. We walked briskly, Holmes leading the way with that peculiar gait of his, half purposeful, half impatient. As we passed into the bustle of Regent Street, he gestured toward the wide display windows of Duvillard and Company. They will remember who bought the gloves, he said, and more importantly, if any second pair has been made. Inside, a pale young clerk in stiff collar and waistcoat greeted us with the wary politeness of someone used to eccentric clientele. Holmes presented the glove and inquired calmly. The clerk examined it with professional care. Yes, sir. One of our custom orders. This pair was made for Miss Charlotte Trowbridge. We retain a record. The left-hand glove was requested to be ever so slightly larger, to accommodate a ring she wears always. Quite insistent about that, she was. A ring? Holmes asked. Yes, a sapphire set in gold, large, heavy, family heirloom, she said. Holmes glanced at me. Then we must assume she is now without. It, or it without her. The implications hung in the air. As we stepped back onto the street, Holmes turned his gaze eastward, toward the direction of Waterloo Station. She left a suitcase behind for us, he murmured, but she also left something else behind. A story no one is yet telling. Let us see what it is hiding in plain sight. And with that, we plunged back into the fog, the suitcase, the glove, and the shadow of Charlotte Trowbridge trailing behind us like the faint perfume of lilacs on cold London air. The journey to Waterloo Station was damp and subdued. The fog, which had hung low all morning, had thickened into something almost tangible, reducing every cab's progress to a crawl and muting even the shrill cries of the newsboys. Holmes remained silent for much of the cab ride, gazing out into the blurred streets with that faraway focus that signaled his mind was assembling the case in pieces I could only guess at. I'd long grown accustomed to his bouts of silence and the sudden, cutting insight they often preceded. When we arrived, Holmes dismissed the cab and strode directly into the cavernous station. The air inside was sharp with coal smoke and the faint scent of grease and damp stone. It was just past midday, but the gas lamps were already glowing overhead to beat back the gloom. Holmes moved past the ticket counters and vendors with barely a glance, his steps purposeful. He made for the left luggage office without a word. I followed closely, noting how his eyes flicked along each locker number and every attendant's movement with careful calculation. At the counter, a bespectacled clerk in a brown waistcoat looked up, startled by Holmes's sudden presence. "Good day," Holmes said. "We've reason to believe a parcel was left here under the initials LO, possibly assigned locker number 4739. The clerk's brows lifted. "That number's well within our active rotation, sir, but unless you've a ticket or matching identification—" Holmes slipped a coin across the counter with such fluid elegance that the man's hesitation vanished. "I'm not asking you to break protocol, only to recall whether a woman, dark hair, French perfume, carrying a suitcase of this size and shape, deposited anything here on Tuesday last." The clerk considered. "Tuesday. Now that you mention it, there was a young lady, mid-20s, wore a navy hat with a feather, rather fine gloves, spoke with a trace of French. She left a case, yes, and asked that it not be claimed until Thursday." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And has anyone come for it?" "Not yet." "Then you will take us to locker 4739, Holmes said, "and if it contains what I suspect, I shall see to it you face no trouble for this minor deviation." The clerk hesitated only a second before fetching a ring of iron keys and leading us into the narrow corridor lined with lockers. The metallic doors stood in long, uniform rows, all painted a dull green. Locker 4739 was halfway down the aisle. The clerk slid in the key, turned it, and pulled open the door. Inside was another suitcase, nearly identical to the one we had received that morning. Holmes made no sound. He simply nodded. "Do not touch it," he said to the clerk. "Doctor." "Watson, if you would." I stepped forward cautiously and lifted the case out onto the floor. Holmes crouched and examined it. He checked the seams, the handle, the base, then reached into his coat pocket and drew out the brass key we had discovered earlier. It fit the lock precisely. A soft click echoed in the narrow corridor as Holmes turned it and lifted the lid. The interior was plain this time. No velvet lining, no perfume, no envelope. Instead, there was a single object resting on top of folded newspaper, a cello bow. Polished wood, ivory frog, hair taut and gleaming, and wrapped around the bow's base, tied like a ribbon, was a lock of dark hair. Holmes reached in and lifted the bow with the tenderness of a man handling a violin of Stradivarius vintage. "No initials," he muttered. "But the craftsmanship is exquisite. W.E. Hill and Sons. Custom. This would not have been pawned or discarded casually." He turned to me. "Watson, compare this lock of hair with the strands on the glove." I retrieved the glove from my coat and matched the loose strands still caught in the fingers. The match was plain to see, the same hue of dark chestnut, the same fine texture. "Her hair," I said softly. "It must be hers." Holmes nodded. "She's leaving breadcrumbs. Not for the police. Not for her uncle. For us." "But why?" I asked. "If she is in danger, why this deliberate trail?" "Because she fears interception," Holmes said, standing. "A direct cry for help may expose her. But if she frames it as a puzzle, as a sequence of minor mysteries, then the correct solver will find her before the wrong party does. She trusts deduction more than authority." He looked at the clerk. "We shall take this suitcase. If anyone comes asking for it, you will say only that it was claimed." The man nodded nervously. Holmes pressed another coin into his palm and swept the suitcase up under one arm. We exited the station swiftly, Holmes walking now with greater urgency. Once we were back out in the grey murk of the streets, I asked the question that had been pressing on my thoughts since we first saw the cello bow. You asked her uncle whether she had musical talents. Did you already suspect she might leave something like this? Holmes shook his head. Number. But when one is constructing a mental image of a woman brave enough to vanish and clever enough to leave a trail of objects, one must imagine her habits, her tools, her language. To Charlotte Trowbridge, it appears music is not merely performance, it is identity. The bow is not just an instrument's limb, it is, for her, a fingerprint. We walked in silence for a moment before Holmes spoke again, slower this time. And there is another meaning. I turned to him. What do you mean? She has left us her glove. Now her bow. Two things intimately personal, intentionally singular. Not the pair of gloves. Not the cello, just one. A left glove. A bow without an instrument. She is showing us that something is missing, not just from her belongings, but from the entire picture. She's showing us absence, I said. Exactly, Holmes replied. That single word hung in the air between us. Back at Baker Street, Holmes placed the cello bow beside the first suitcase. He stared at both for several minutes before returning to his desk and spreading out the fragments of evidence like a map. The torn railway ticket, the note, the glove, the bow, the key. We must return to Knightsbridge, he said finally. To the home of Mrs. Endicott, the companion. Something in that house has not been properly understood. I glanced at the clock. Do you believe Charlotte Trowbridge is still alive? Holmes did not answer immediately. I believe, he said slowly, that she believes she can survive what she has placed herself into. But it is not a certainty. And if we are slow, Watson, if we miss the next step, then this will become a case of recovery, not rescue. He rose and reached for his hat. I've often said that the art of deduction is rooted in the ability to notice what is not present. Let us see what is not present at Mrs. Endicott's residence. And once more, we descended the steps of 221B and vanished into the thick, whispering fog of London. The address Lord Trowbridge had given us led to a quiet row of respectable Georgian homes off Knightsbridge Road, their brick facades neatly kept, their windows curtained in white lace. It was the sort of place where scandal was whispered behind drawn blinds and where, as Holmes would later remark, even the laundry hangs with discretion. The fog still clung to the street like an old dog refusing to leave its doorstep, though the light had begun to turn a pallid yellow as the afternoon pressed on. We were greeted at the door by a maid in a drab uniform, her hair hastily pinned, her expression tired. Holmes offered a polite nod. Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, here on behalf of Lord Trowbridge. We wish to speak with Mrs. Endicott. The maid hesitated. She's not been receiving visitors, sir, not since Miss Trowbridge went missing. Holmes fixed her with a look that brooked no refusal. Then kindly inform her we are not visitors. We are resolution. The girl blinked, uncertain what to make of the phrasing, but disappeared obediently down the hall. Moments later, we were ushered into a small sitting room with floral wallpaper and a faint aroma of lavender and coal smoke. A fire burned in the grate, and above it hung a watercolor of the Scottish coast, bleak cliffs under a pale sky. Mrs. Endicott entered with a rustle of skirts and a tight-lipped frown. She was a woman of perhaps 60, rigid in bearing, her graying hair pinned in a severe bun. There was intelligence behind her eyes, but also a guardedness that suggested years of handling delicate family matters without the luxury of sentiment. I understand you've come from Lord Trowbridge, she said, settling into an armchair without offering one to us. Indeed, Holmes replied smoothly. We've been asked to look into Miss Charlotte Trowbridge's recent disappearance. She has not disappeared, Mr. Holmes. She has taken leave. Without informing anyone, yes. But I've no reason to believe she's in any danger. Holmes studied her. And yet you haven't reported her absence to the authorities. Mrs. Endicott's eyes narrowed. Because I respect her privacy. Charlotte is a fiercely independent young woman. Impulsive, yes, but not foolish. She has taken unannounced excursions before. I assumed she would return when she was ready. Even now, I asked. She has been gone 3 days. Mrs. Endicott hesitated, a flicker of concern crossing her features. It is unusual, I grant you, but I trust Charlotte to manage herself. Holmes let the silence stretch for a moment, then moved to a small side table where a silver-framed photograph sat. He examined it with deliberate slowness. "A recent likeness?" he asked. "Yes," Mrs. Endicott said tightly. "Taken last summer in Sussex." Holmes set it down. "May I ask what she was wearing when she departed?" "A navy coat, high-collared. Gloves. Her hat had a feather, dark blue. I remember that because I told her it was entirely too flamboyant for February." "A hat and gloves," Holmes repeated. "Anything else missing from her room?" "Her travel suitcase and her cello." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "She took the instrument with her?" Mrs. Endicott sighed. "She often travels with it. There was to be a performance next week at Lady Havisham's salon. She had been practicing endlessly." Holmes nodded, then turned to survey the room. His gaze passed briefly over the bookcase, the writing desk, the embroidery frame, then paused. He stepped toward the small escritoire near the window, where a half-used candle had dripped wax onto the blotting paper. "May I?" he asked. Mrs. Endicott gave a reluctant nod. Holmes opened the top drawer. Inside were the usual contents: stationery, a letter opener, an unused stick of sealing wax. But it was the second drawer that caught his attention. He drew out a slim music folio, opened it, and revealed a sheet of handwritten notation. "She was composing," he murmured. Mrs. Endicott's tone shifted slightly. "Yes, she often wrote small pieces, personal work. She never shared them publicly." Holmes examined the page. The notes were scrawled in a tight hand, but precise. Near the top corner, a date had been penciled in: February 10th. Below it, a short phrase: "Variation on the minor." He passed the sheet to me. "Watson, do you observe anything curious about this piece?" I glanced at the music. To my untrained eye, it was an elegant mess of symbols and lines. "I confess it appears musical," I said. Holmes gave a faint smile. "Precisely, but also incomplete. There are only 17 bars, no repeat signs, no crescendo. It ends mid-phrase, as if interrupted." Mrs. Endicott looked uneasy. She often worked in fragments. "Perhaps. Or perhaps she began encoding something in the only language no one in her circle would examine too closely." He turned suddenly to the maid, who had returned to the doorway unnoticed. "Tell me, when Miss Trowbridge left, did she say anything unusual? Any message? Any name?" The girl hesitated, biting her lip. "She said only, 'If anyone asks where I've gone, tell them I left a melody behind.'" Then she smiled and walked out. Holmes' eyes flashed. "A melody?" He turned back to the manuscript and scanned it again, this time not with a musician's eye, but with a code breaker's. "Every note, Watson, is a letter. Do, re, mi, translated chromatically. It's a rudimentary cipher, but clever in its disguise. She's left us something." He folded the sheet carefully and placed it in his coat. Mrs. Endicott stood abruptly. "I won't have you turning her disappearance into a stage play, Mr. Holmes. She is a sensitive young woman, and this insinuation that she's involved in some intrigue, it's fanciful." Holmes nodded politely. "So it may seem. But Miss Trowbridge does not strike me as one who leaves without purpose, and purpose always leaves traces." We departed with little ceremony. Outside, the fog had begun to lift slightly, the outlines of hansom cabs and chimney pots emerging with ghostly clarity. Holmes walked with unusual speed, the music sheet clenched in his gloved hand. "She's guiding us to the next step, Watson. A melody left behind, a coded score, and I believe I know someone who can interpret it faster than I." "Who?" "Wiggins," he said. "Our former street urchin has matured into a capable violinist. He plays part-time with a music hall in Covent Garden. More importantly, he knows when notes mean more than just sound." As we hailed a cab toward Covent Garden, I could not help but feel the pace of the mystery accelerating. Charlotte Trowbridge's voice, long silent, was now beginning to hum between the cracks of each clue. The glove, the bow, the ciphered melody, they were not cries for help. They were her map, and Holmes, with each deduction, was drawing closer to wherever she had gone, or been taken. The cab rattled through the narrowing lanes toward Covent Garden, Holmes unusually quiet beside me. He sat with the folded manuscript in his lap, fingers drumming against its edge in an almost musical rhythm. The clamor of late-afternoon London pressed around us. Vendors, shouting in the market square, boot heels clapping on wet stone, the faint strain of a street violinist echoing from the shadows. And yet, within the confines of that cramped hansom, Holmes's mind was far away, likely already halfway through the ciphered melody. It was not the first time he had seen music used as code, but there was something about this instance that had unsettled him. I could see it in the tautness of his mouth and the abrupt way he tapped his cane when we arrived. The theatre was modest, a converted hall behind Bow Street with peeling signage and the faint smell of damp velvet. Holmes led the way through a side alley to the rear entrance, where a bored-looking boy with a flute under one arm leaned against a stack of crates. "We're looking for Wiggins," Holmes said. The boy brightened at the name and jerked his thumb toward the back. "Tuning up. Third room past the costume racks." Holmes nodded and led us through the dim corridor, past rustling curtains and the murmur of warm-up scales. When we reached the room in question, the door was already ajar. Wiggins, once a scrappy leader of Holmes's street-level informants, had grown into a wiry young man with sharp features and calloused fingertips. He was tuning a violin under a bare gaslight, his expression intensely focused. But the moment he looked up and saw Holmes, he grinned. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, setting the violin down. "You still stalk London's ghosts, then?" "Only those that wish to be found," Holmes replied. "We need your ears, Wiggins, and perhaps your eyes, if they're still as sharp as they were when you could pick a pocket faster than a pickpocket's conscience." "I'm reformed, Mr. Holmes," Wiggins said with a lopsided smile. "But I'll play your ghost song if you've brought it." Holmes handed over the manuscript, watching closely as Wiggins scanned the notes. "It's not a full composition," Wiggins murmured. "Stops dead here, almost as if she ran out of paper or time. But it's not meant to be heard, I don't think." "No," Holmes said. "It's meant to be read." Wiggins narrowed his eyes, then lifted his violin and began to play. The melody was strange, unsettling in its pauses, its rises and falls oddly spaced. Yet there was a pattern beneath it, like a message trying to be heard through static. When Wiggins lowered the bow, the final note hung in the air like the curl of smoke above a candle. "She's spelling something," he said. "Listen to the scale. Each note corresponds to a letter. She's shifted them, C as A, D as B, and so on." Holmes was already at the table, transcribing. "Let me confirm," he said. "Your interpretation begins with F, then A, then C, then B, E, and so on," Wiggins said. "It repeats the motif but altered. Look here, she modulates abruptly, jumps an interval that makes no musical sense. It's deliberate." Holmes wrote, furiously. I leaned over his shoulder as the letters formed FACBEADGROMANDIENNE. He paused, then adjusted a few lines. "From Andien." Holmes sat back. "It's a location, from Andien, though not spelled correctly." "It could be phonetic," I offered. "A name, perhaps." Wiggins tapped his bow against his knee. "Could be Andean is meant to sound like Andean Wharf, down by the East India Docks. The old shipping offices near Wapping. I used to run messages there when I was a lad. Haven't heard the place mentioned in years." Holmes looked up sharply. Of course. That would align with the brass key. Many of those offices had private lock boxes, small brass fittings, custom shapes. Some were once used to store documents before shipping. He turned to me. "She's left something there. But wouldn't she have gone herself?" "No," Holmes said, "because to be seen going back would compromise her. This isn't merely about escape. She's navigating through a hostile space. She can't trust the normal routes, so she's made a trail only one person could follow." He stood abruptly. "Wiggins, your help has been invaluable. If you ever tire of honest music, you might consider dishonest espionage again." Wiggins laughed and tucked the manuscript into his case. "If you find her, Mr. Holmes, tell her she writes better puzzles than sonatas." We departed immediately, the evening pressing in with greater urgency. Holmes hailed a cab, and we made for Wapping at once. The fog was returning with its usual ferocity, and by the time we reached the docklands, it rolled in waves across the cobblestones, lit faintly by the yellow lanterns swaying from blackened poles. The buildings there were old and soot-streaked, monuments to an industrial age already beginning to rust. Andean Wharf was barely marked, the iron letters half faded on the stone arch that led into the yard. A heavy wooden door stood at the back of a long row of once busy shipping offices, its lock battered by salt air and time. Holmes held up the brass key and inserted it into the mechanism. It turned smoothly. The door creaked open into darkness. Holmes drew his lantern from his coat, lit it, and stepped inside. I followed, heart pounding. The interior was sparse, a desk, a broken stool, a ledger shelf thick with dust. In the back wall, just above waist height, was a small square compartment, metal-edged and sealed with a brass latch. Holmes opened it. Inside, wrapped in waxed linen, was a small stack of documents bound with red twine. He carried them to the light and began to inspect the first few pages. His breath caught. "These are shipping records," he murmured. "And not only that. They detail cargo movements between Calais and London, chartered under pseudonyms. Look here. Freight, musical instruments. And yet the tonnage listed is far too great. It's a cover." "For what?" I asked. Holmes flipped to the second bundle. "Chemicals, explosives, smuggled in crates marked as cellos and violins." He turned to me slowly. Charlotte Trowbridge stumbled into something vast. She wasn't just fleeing scandal. She discovered a network, a clandestine operation using musical equipment to mask contraband imports. Perhaps innocently at first, but she realized what she was caught inside, and she ran. "But she didn't run far," I said quietly. "No," Holmes replied. "She stayed close enough to plant the truth." There was a sound then, a soft scrape outside. Holmes extinguished the lantern instantly. We stood frozen, the dark pressing against us like velvet. Then a voice, low and muffled, from beyond the door. "She said they'd come." A second voice. "Are you sure it's them?" Holmes's hand moved to the latch, slow and quiet. He leaned in and whispered, "Back wall. There's a side exit behind those crates." We moved as one, silent, careful, retreating through the shadows as the voices grew louder. The door creaked again. Footsteps entered. A match flared. They hadn't seen us. We slipped through the gap, into the misty yard beyond. Holmes closed the side gate behind us and pulled me into the alley. "They're watching the trail," he said. "Charlotte must have known, which means she's not just clever. She's hunted." And for the first time in this entire case, I saw something flicker in Holmes's expression that was not calculation, nor irony, nor even resolve. It was concern. We did not speak again until we were several streets away from Andean Wharf, the fog thickening behind us like a curtain drawn to cover a scene abruptly abandoned. Holmes walked quickly, his long stride unbroken, though I could feel the tension humming beneath his coat sleeves. I said nothing, choosing instead to follow his lead until we reached the quiet sanctuary of a coffee house just off Cable Street, an unassuming little corner establishment Holmes occasionally used for its dim lighting and discreet back booths. Inside, the gas lamps burned low, and the scent of roasted beans hung in the air like a comfort. We seated ourselves in a narrow corner, and Holmes set the packet of documents between us. He unwrapped the waxed linen again, more slowly this time, and began inspecting the shipping manifests with greater care. "These names," he murmured, pointing to the consignee list on the third page. "They're fabrications. But look, here, this one repeats under 2 aliases. Jean Martel receives cello crates in London and also signs off identical deliveries in Calais." "Meaning he's controlling both ends of the trade," I said. "Precisely," Holmes said. "And further, note the dates. 2 shipments last month coincide with Charlotte's travel to and from Paris. She may have been used as a courier, unknowingly at first, perhaps, but not for long. She was observant, inquisitive, and, above all, principled. She would not have tolerated this sort of exploitation." I glanced around to ensure we remained unnoticed, then lowered my voice. "You believe she attempted to expose them?" Holmes nodded. "But not through the police. She knew the network was too protected, too entrenched, and so she created a breadcrumb trail, carefully doled out, trusting that someone, namely me, would piece it together before they caught her." "She's alive then," I said. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "For now." A waitress approached with 2 cups of coffee we had not ordered. Holmes must have nodded for them upon entry. He sipped his slowly, then leaned forward. "There's a name we haven't discussed," he said. "One that appears only once, but significantly." He turned a page in the bundle and tapped a final receipt clipped at the back. "Delivery to V. LaRue, Kensington Square, London, special handling required." "V. LaRue," I read aloud. "It's not among the aliases." "No," Holmes said, "because it isn't one. That is a real name, and it appears only once. That alone would have been curious. But what makes it more than curious is this." He pulled from his coat a slim pocketbook and opened it to a page marked in pencil. "This is Charlotte's last entry in the Paris guest registry," he said. "A small boarding house near Montmartre. She signed herself in on the 15th of January, stayed 2 nights, and departed on the 17th. The only other English name listed that week was Victor Leroux." My blood stirred. "Then she followed him." "Or stumbled across him," Holmes replied. "Either way, his presence is not coincidental. The fact that he reappears here, under his real name no less, suggests either arrogance or immunity." Holmes pocketed the documents, finished his coffee in a single motion, and stood. "We're calling on Mr. Leroux." It was already nearing 6 when we arrived at Kensington Square. The houses here were grand and reserved, their brick fronts washed in grey light, their gardens trimmed with military precision. Number 18 stood in the northern corner, its curtains drawn, its windows glowing faintly from within. Holmes knocked. The butler, who answered, looked like a man hired more for silence than service, broad-shouldered, bald, with the eyes of a professional observer. "We are here to see Mr. Leroux," Holmes said. The man did not ask who we were. He merely stepped aside. We were ushered into a drawing room of impeccable taste, dark oak furniture, a Turkish rug, a collection of minor impressionist works hung with deliberate nonchalance. And there, by the fire, stood Victor Leroux. He was younger than I expected, perhaps 30, with sharp features and blonde hair brushed back in a military style. His posture was perfect, his eyes unreadable. "You've come quickly," he said, his accent lightly continental. "That was expected." Holmes gave the faintest tilt of his head. Then let us dispense with pretense. You're receiving crates under musical designation which contain contraband. Explosives, to be precise. Your shipping records from Calais are forged, your London entries maintained through an intermediary network, and a young woman, Charlotte Trowbridge, has vanished after attempting to expose you. Leroux said nothing for a moment. Then he smiled. She is clever, isn't she? The fire popped in the grate behind him. But she overestimated the reach of conscience. Leroux continued. The English are sentimental. You build cathedrals for heroes and expect villains to leave calling cards. We do not play with such manners. And yet, Holmes said, stepping toward him, she left a message. More than one, each more precise than the last. If you've harmed her, Leroux raised a hand. She is alive. The tension in my chest eased, then sharpened at his next words. For now. You hold her, I said. Leroux looked at me, almost pityingly. I do not, but she is in custody, of someone far less patient than I. She was intercepted 2 nights ago in Limehouse, trying to pass those documents to a contact. The man was clever. She was cleverer, but not clever enough. Where is she? Holmes asked, low and steady. She is being moved, Leroux said. Tonight. I do not know where. That's the cost of delegation. Holmes stepped closer, and for the first time I saw in his expression not deduction, but fury. You orchestrated her entrapment. Leroux's smile vanished. I contained a threat. That's not orchestration, it's preservation. And I suggest you withdraw from this now, Mr. Holmes, before the trail turns back on you. Holmes leaned in, voice like frost. I withdraw from nothing, and Charlotte Trowbridge is under my protection, whether you believe it or not. We left abruptly, Holmes silent again until we reached the square's edge. The street lamps buzzed faintly above us, casting long shadows against the brick. We have until midnight, Holmes said. Until what? Until she's gone, he said. He meant it. She'll be moved tonight, possibly out of the country, possibly killed. I stopped in the lamplight. How do we find her? Holmes turned to me, his eyes focused as daggers. Because she left one more clue, he said, in the music. I frowned, but we deciphered it, Andean Wharf. Number that was the first key, but she said she left a melody. Singular, and Wiggins said the piece was incomplete. Holmes reached into his coat and retrieved the manuscript again. He unfolded it under the lamplight, scanning it once more. Then, slowly, he tapped the final 4 notes. She ends with a repetition, but broken by a tritone. It's not a phrase, it's a signal, a location. He turned to me. There's only one place in London where a tritone rings out every night. The church bell at St. Dunstan's on the river. It was famously miscast in 1856. Its strike is off by 2 semitones. St. Dunstan's, I said, startled. It's been abandoned for years. Holmes was already walking. Exactly. No one watches the ruins. No one listens for the wrong notes, which is precisely why she chose it. And as the fog thickened once more around us, we followed Charlotte's melody, into the night, into the ruins, and toward whatever waited beyond the broken chime. The fog had thickened into a living thing by the time we reached the edge of Fleet Street. It coiled between the buildings and slithered down alleyways like a patient hunter. St. Dunstan's loomed beyond it, half forgotten, hemmed in by warehouses and river smoke, its crumbling spire a silhouette against the murk. Time had not been kind to the place. The nave was roofless, its windows empty sockets, and the outer stone bore the scars of soot and silence. But the bell still hung in the tower, tilted awkwardly on its rusted yoke, and it was that bell Holmes led us toward, with purpose in his step and his collar turned high against the wet. The churchyard was quiet, save for the occasional creak of iron as the wind passed through the gate. Holmes pushed it open gently, its hinges groaning like an old throat clearing. We entered the grounds, our boots crunching gravel, our breath misting in the air. The door to the sanctuary had long since rotted from its frame. We passed through the arch and into the nave, where damp moss had overtaken the stone floor and fragments of stained glass glittered faintly in the corners. Holmes did not pause. He strode directly to the rear transept, where the bell tower rose in a square stack above the church. A roped-off stairwell spiraled upward into shadow. "This is where she wanted us," Holmes said, drawing a lantern from beneath his coat. He lit it, its glow illuminating the first few steps. I followed close behind as we ascended, the stairs narrow and slick beneath our feet. The air grew colder the higher we climbed, and somewhere above us, the old bell gave a low metallic groan as if it too sensed we were drawing near. We reached the belfry moments later. The room was small and square, the stone dark with soot and age. The bell itself hung suspended in the center, its bronze surface blackened by time. But it was not the bell that caught our attention. It was the figure slumped in the corner. Holmes rushed forward, lantern held high. I moved to his side, and there she was, Charlotte Trowbridge, alive, barely. She was bound at the wrists and ankles, a gag tied loosely across her mouth. Her clothes were damp and torn, her cheek bruised, but her eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes, flashed wide at the sight of Holmes. "Watson," he said briskly. "The knife." I had it ready in seconds. We cut her bonds, Holmes removing the gag with care. She drew a long, ragged breath. "You came," she whispered. "Of course," Holmes replied softly. "You left a melody? I simply followed the key." She tried to sit up, and I moved to support her. They were going to move me tonight," she said. "To the river, south of Blackwall. I overheard them arguing. One wanted to be done with me. The other insisted on waiting." Holmes helped her to her feet. "You've done remarkably well, Miss Trowbridge." "I couldn't risk a direct message," she said. "They were watching everything, my uncle's home, my friend's address, even the hall where I performed." "You were working alone?" "Not at first. I had a contact, a man in customs, but he vanished the day before I returned from Calais. I knew I had to lay a trail in pieces, in a language they wouldn't decipher." "Music," I said. She managed a weak smile. "You can't lie in melody, Dr. Watson. Notes either belong or they don't." It was the only truth I could leave behind. Holmes turned toward the stairwell. "We must get her out of here before they realize she's no longer in their grip." But even as he spoke, a sound echoed up the stairwell. Boots on stone, slow and deliberate. Holmes extinguished the lantern in one swift motion, plunging the belfry into darkness. I reached instinctively for Charlotte's arm and pulled her behind the bell's shadow as Holmes moved toward the opposite wall. The footsteps grew louder. Then a voice, low and unmistakable. "She said they'd come here. Didn't I tell you?" "Victor Leroux," another voice replied. Rougher, older. "Check the tower. If she's still here, end it." Quietly. Holmes leaned toward me in the dark, his whisper barely audible. "3 of them. 1 on the stairs. 1 below. Leroux at the door." He reached into his coat and produced the small whistle he sometimes carried for signaling the police, but hesitated. "Too far. We'll need to delay them." Charlotte pulled gently on my sleeve. "There's another way out," she breathed. "The scaffolding outside the bell window. The masons were repairing the tower months ago. It hasn't been taken down." Holmes turned toward the arched opening in the north wall. Moonlight bled faintly through the broken glass. Outside, barely visible in the fog, a wooden beam extended along the tower's side, wrapped in tarpaulin and rope. "It'll have to do," he said. We crossed the belfry in silence, the floorboards creaking softly beneath us. Holmes went first, testing the beam. It bowed under his weight, but held. "Follow exactly," he said. I helped Charlotte out next, guiding her hands to the rope. The fog seemed thicker up here, the city reduced to a smear of pale gaslight below. Holmes led the way across the beam, every step a prayer, every creak a warning. Below us, voices rose inside the tower. "She's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" "Gone, you idiot. The ropes are cut." A pistol fired below, the shot echoing like thunder through the ruined church. We moved faster. The scaffold curved around to the far side of the tower, where a set of ladders descended toward the apse. Holmes reached the first rung, then motioned for us to follow. We descended in haste, Charlotte's strength waning, but her will unbroken. We reached the ground moments later, breathless but safe. Holmes wasted no time. He pulled us toward the alley that ran behind the churchyard, where a hansom cab stood as if waiting for a ghost. "Driver," Holmes called. "To Scotland Yard. Quickly." We climbed in. As the cab lurched into motion, I glanced back. 2 men emerged from the ruins. One raised his arm, but Holmes had already drawn his revolver. "No closer," he shouted. "The woman is under my protection, and Scotland Yard is expecting our arrival." The figures vanished into the fog. Charlotte collapsed into the seat beside me, shaking. "You weren't supposed to come," she said softly. "They said no one would follow." Holmes looked at her. "Then they underestimated music, and the man who hears it." She closed her eyes, leaning against my shoulder, and for the first time that day I allowed myself to exhale. Not because it was over, but because the trail had finally led to its truth. The cab raced through the sleeping city, its iron wheels clattering over the wet cobblestones like a ticking clock winding down. Holmes sat stiffly across from me, his arms folded, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the rain-slicked window. Charlotte Trowbridge, pale and spent, had slipped into a half-conscious doze against my shoulder, her fingers still faintly trembling despite my attempts to steady them. The lamplight outside flickered across her bruised cheek, making the moment feel somehow more fragile. Holmes hadn't spoken since we left St. Dunstan's, but I knew better than to mistake his silence for calm. His mind was alight behind those unreadable eyes, weighing and measuring every piece that still didn't quite fit. And there were pieces. Of that, I was certain. LaRue had let us go too easily. The men in the tower hadn't pursued. It wasn't triumph Holmes wore on his face. It was worry. At last, he spoke, low and precise. There was no fear in LaRue's eyes, Watson, not even urgency. He allowed us to take her, knowing full well she could implicate him. "You think he wanted her to lead us somewhere? I think he's still holding something, or someone, and this," he gestured to the bruised, sleeping figure beside me, "wasn't the prize. She was a pawn, and he's already planned the next move." The cab turned sharply, lanterns swinging as we neared the broad courtyard of Scotland Yard. 2 constables recognized Holmes on sight and stepped forward before the cab even stopped. "Urgent," Holmes said, leaping out. "Get Inspector Gregson or Lestrade, whichever is available. We have a witness and a list of contraband shipments that could unravel half of East London's underworld." One of the men nodded and hurried inside as Holmes helped me guide Charlotte from the cab. She roused slightly at the cold air, but her words were still slurred, her energy frayed. Inside, we were led to a quiet interrogation room. A physician was summoned, and Holmes handed off the sealed package of shipping documents to a clerk with instructions to deliver them directly to Inspector Lestrade, unopened, unread, and under guard. Minutes later, Lestrade himself entered, looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. He greeted Holmes with a curt nod, then turned to me. "She all right?" "She will be," I said, "though she's been through far more than we know." Lestrade gestured for Holmes to speak, and Holmes, in his usual fashion, laid out the case with surgical clarity, from the anonymous suitcase to the ciphered music, to Charlotte's trail of clues, and finally the ruined belfry where we found her. Lestrade listened without interruption, though the furrow between his brows deepened with each step. When Holmes had finished, Lestrade leaned back with a sigh. "This LaRue fellow, he's real." "Very," Holmes replied. French by birth, employed in the past as a liaison between diplomatic couriers and private security firms. He knows how to vanish. But his mistake was underestimating the cleverness of a young woman with a conscience and my ability to hear her message. "And now?" Lestrade asked. "Now," Holmes said, "we move before he does. I'll issue the warrant." "No," Holmes said quickly. "That's what he wants. If we push too soon, we force his hand. He still has a trump card. There's someone else involved, possibly Charlotte's contact in customs. Someone she trusted who went missing just before she fled. I believe he's alive, being used as leverage. Leroux isn't protecting himself now. He's baiting us." Lestrade frowned. "Why?" "To clean the board. He knew Charlotte would lead us to the evidence, and he made no move to stop her, because he expects us to reach for a win and walk straight into his trap." Lestrade tapped the table. "Then how do we spring it without getting snapped ourselves?" Holmes smiled faintly. "By making him believe the trap is already closed." He turned to me. "Watson, you'll stay here with Miss Trowbridge. She needs protection and rest, and she may yet recall something vital. Lestrade and I have work to do." Before I could protest, Holmes had already stood and crossed to the door. "Where are you going?" I asked. "To the East India Docks," he said without turning, "where the next crate is scheduled to arrive before dawn, and if my suspicions are correct, someone will be inside it. Alive. Barely." He vanished with Lestrade at his side. I turned to Charlotte. She stirred under the woolen coat wrapped around her, her lips moving faintly. "Holmes?" she asked, eyes fluttering. "Open." "He's gone to finish what you started," I said gently. "You've done enough." Her eyes searched mine, dazed but steady. "There was another man," she whispered. "Not Leroux. Someone else. English, always behind the curtain. I never saw his face clearly, but I heard him once. He called me a delicate investment." She closed her eyes again. His voice, it had no accent, clean. Cold, I felt a chill settle in my chest. I stayed with her until the early light of dawn crept into the window. Holmes returned just past 7, his coat stained with coal dust, his face drawn but fierce. He didn't speak until the door closed behind him. "We found the crate," he said. I rose. And the man? Alive. Thomas Avery. Charlotte's contact in customs. Tortured, but alive. And Leroux? Gone. Slipped the perimeter 3 minutes before we arrived. No trace. But he left something behind. He handed me a folded slip of parchment. The writing was neat, fluid, chilling. "You listened, she played. I concede the symphony. But remember, maestro, the next performance is mine." Holmes exhaled slowly. "It's not over." "No," I said, reading the note again. "But for now, Charlotte lives. The truth lives." Holmes glanced toward the door where she rested, then out the window where the city slowly began to stir. "For now," he echoed, softer. "And sometimes, Watson, that is victory enough." The day wore on beneath a sky the color of soot, and Holmes, though silent, remained anything but still. Back in our lodgings at Baker Street, he paced from window to desk and back again, pausing only to scribble on a sheet of notepaper, rearrange the items on the mantel, or examine the creased note left by Leroux once more, as though it might reveal a second hidden cipher. I remained nearby, keeping one ear on the street below in case a carriage pulled up with unwelcome haste, and the other on Holmes's shifting footfalls, which had taken on the cadence of a man measuring time in thought rather than seconds. Charlotte was safe. That much we knew. Inspector Lestrade had doubled the guard at Scotland Yard and personally overseen her transfer to a secure hospital wing for further observation. The man Holmes had recovered from the crate, Thomas Avery, was still unconscious, his condition precarious. But he had lived, and that fact alone had sharpened the edge of Holmes's focus like a whetstone against steel. Still, it wasn't Leroux that kept Holmes pacing. It was the phrase he had written. The next performance is mine." "This was never about one shipment," Holmes muttered, finally breaking the long silence. "Not even about Charlotte. She was merely a variable he couldn't predict, an improvisation in his orchestration." "You think LaRue planned this entire affair to draw you in?" I asked. "I know he did," Holmes said grimly. "Everything he allowed us to uncover, he meant for us to find the suitcase, the glove, the ciphered music. It all bore the marks of deliberate artistry, Watson. He wanted me involved. He wanted to set the tempo." I frowned. "But to what end? If he's escaped, and the operation is now exposed, what could he possibly stand to gain?" Holmes turned slowly, then gestured to the note again. "Control, Watson. He wants me off balance. He knows that a symphony doesn't need to be played entirely to move its audience. It only requires the right movement at the right time. He's telling us this was Act 1. "And Act 2? I asked. Holmes walked to the window and gazed down at the street, where a milk cart clattered past a huddle of coal boys. The city went on as always, unaware that a ghost now moved among it. "We need to look not at what he did," Holmes said, "but what he didn't. LaRue is not a man to waste opportunities. If he's conceding this symphony, it's because he's already composed the next one." At that moment, there came a sharp knock on the door downstairs, followed by Mrs. Hudson's muffled voice and then the sound of heavy boots ascending the stairs. Lestrade entered without ceremony, rain still glistening on his coat. "I've news," he said, glancing at Holmes, "and not the kind you'll like." Holmes gestured to the chair by the hearth. "Proceed." Lestrade removed a damp folder from inside his coat and tossed it onto the table. Holmes opened it. Inside were photographs, notes, and a single thin envelope sealed in red wax. "That arrived at the yard an hour ago," Lestrade said. "No return address. It was marked private for Mr. Sherlock Holmes." I opened it, thinking it might be a threat. It wasn't. Holmes slit the wax and pulled out a single page. His eyes scanned it quickly. Then again, slower. "Another message?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer. He handed it to me instead. The writing was the same, elegant, deliberate. "You sought a performer, Mr. Holmes. But perhaps you've forgotten the conductor. You pulled the girl from the shadows. Well done. Now ask yourself, who placed her there? Or better yet, why did she fall so easily into the role? 2 scores remain. You've read the prelude. Shall we now begin the overture? The curtain rises tomorrow, Westminster Bridge, 10 past noon. Bring your violin or your scalpel." The note wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Lestrade crossed his arms. "What do you make of it?" Holmes's face was unreadable. "It confirms my suspicion," he said. "LaRue was not acting alone." "You mean the Englishman Charlotte mentioned?" I asked. The voice she heard. Holmes nodded. She was not exaggerating. LaRue may have been the visible hand, but someone else pulled the strings. This conductor, he's the architect. And now he's inviting us to watch the next act unfold in public. Lestrade swore under his breath. "Westminster Bridge. That's a crowded spot. We'll need to deploy constables discreetly. Too many uniforms, and we risk panic." Holmes held up a hand. "No police. Not unless you want the entire event to dissolve into chaos." Lestrade looked incredulous. "You want to face him alone?" "I want to understand his game," Holmes said. "He's testing us. If he wished to kill me, he wouldn't ask me to come to the bridge. He wants something else. Attention, acknowledgement, possibly even admiration." "You think this is vanity?" "I think," Holmes said coldly, "that we're dealing with someone who believes himself not just above the law, but outside it. A mind that sees crime not as necessity, but as art. LaRue was methodical. This man is theatrical." Lestrade stood. "You'll keep me informed?" "Of course," Holmes said, but his tone made it clear he would not. Once Lestrade had gone, Holmes returned to the note. He stared at it for some time, then opened the envelope again. He held it to the light. "There," he said softly. A faint watermark emerged. "A monogram. R.D." "R.D.," I said. "That mean anything to you?" Holmes smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. "It does now," he said. "But first we meet him on his stage." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the fog finally having lifted after days of its choking presence. The air had a sharpness to it, a clarity that only made the task ahead feel more precise. Holmes dressed in silence, choosing his charcoal overcoat and dark gloves. I matched his pace, loading my revolver and tucking it into my inner pocket. We arrived at Westminster Bridge 5 minutes early. The Thames rolled dark and wide beneath the arches, gulls circling overhead. Morning traffic clattered past, carriages, drays, street peddlers shouting their wares. It looked like any other day. Holmes scanned the crowd but made no move. We waited. Then, at exactly 12:10, a tall man stepped from a black carriage that had drawn up near the far end of the bridge. He wore no disguise. Holmes stiffened. The man walked slowly toward us. He was perhaps 50, clean-shaven, with an aristocrat's bearing and the cool, polished detachment of someone used to command. He paused 2 paces from Holmes and smiled faintly. "Mr. Holmes," he said. "At last?" "Mr. Radley Dawn," Holmes replied. And with those words, the conductor stepped into the light, and the next movement of the mystery began. The morning crowd flowed around us, oblivious to the quiet storm unfolding at the center of Westminster Bridge. Carts rattled by, horses whinnied, newsboys barked the headlines near Parliament's silhouette. But within our small orbit of silence, only 3 figures existed: Holmes, myself, and the man who had named himself with no hesitation, Radley Dawn. Holmes did not extend a hand, nor did Dawn expect one. Their eyes met like 2 chess masters studying the board mid-game. No need for flourish, only precision. I had expected a touch more ceremony, Holmes said dryly. Dawn's smile flickered, amused. "Come now, Mr. Holmes, you of all men must appreciate economy. We've very little time and a great deal to consider." "You've orchestrated a campaign of contraband, abduction, and deception across 2 countries, Holmes replied. "Forgive me if I require more than a morning's brisk conversation before I consider your point of view." Dawn raised his brows, seemingly unfazed. "A campaign, you say? Number, that was merely a test. You passed, of course. You always do. But what follows? That will be the composition worth listening to." "And what does it sound like?" Holmes asked. Dawn stepped forward, placing his gloved hands lightly on the stone railing of the bridge. The Thames glinted dully below. "It sounds like inevitability," he said. "You've exposed a single limb of a greater organism, and you've done it brilliantly. But do you know what happens when you cut off the arm of something that has no nerves, Mr. Holmes? It doesn't flinch. It adapts." "An organism," Holmes echoed. "Or a symphony. You mix metaphors." "Only because the truth is more complex than metaphor can serve," Dawn replied. "You see the smugglers, the forgeries, the crate in the warehouse. All notes, yes. Played well. But the melody isn't in the instruments, Holmes. It's in the silence between them. It's what isn't on the page." "You're confessing," I said tightly, stepping forward. "We can bring you in now." But Dawn only looked at me, politely, with a touch of pity. "I'm not here to confess, Doctor. Watson, I'm here because your friend needs to see the shape of what's coming. Consider this a courtesy, the final gift from the conductor before the stage is darkened." Holmes didn't blink. "You said 2 scores remain. What is the second?" Dawn's gaze drifted to the Parliament buildings in the distance. "You'll find it soon, perhaps too soon, perhaps not soon enough." "Tell me this," Holmes said quietly. "Why Charlotte Trowbridge?" Dawn's smile faded. "She was incidental, an audience member who heard something she shouldn't. She reacted with conscience, predictable, though regrettable. We watched her as one might observe a ripple on still water. And then you, Mr. Holmes, stepped into the lake. Holmes's eyes narrowed. You allowed her to survive because you wanted me involved. She became useful, Dawn said. Her rescue gave you purpose. It ensured you would follow the trail with feeling, not detachment. You're sharper when angry. I could feel Holmes stiffen beside me, though his voice remained composed. What is it you want? To see the mind that terrifies governments operate under pressure, Dawn said smoothly. I've read every case, seen every manipulation. Your intellect is extraordinary, but it has one flaw. Holmes tilted his head. Oh, you. Care Dawn stepped back from the railing and adjusted his coat. And that, in the end, is the key difference between us. You move to save, I move to shape. You cut to heal, I cut to reveal. Holmes's voice was steel. You're a sociopath cloaking ideology and metaphor. No, Dawn said. I'm a realist, and I believe the world is due for a dissonance. One you will try and fail to prevent. I drew a slow breath, keeping my hand near my coat pocket. Why come here? Why tell us any of this? Because you've already won the first game, Dawn replied, and because you deserve to know that it meant absolutely nothing. Before Holmes could respond, Dawn turned and walked away, blending with the foot traffic so fluidly that it might have been rehearsed. Holmes made no move to follow. I turned to him sharply. Should we? No, Holmes said softly, his eyes still fixed where Dawn had stood. He wanted us to follow. It's another stage, another illusion. If we pursue, we give up initiative. We stood there for several moments, both of us still absorbing the implications. At last, Holmes said, We need to return to Baker Street. Immediately. We arrived less than 30 minutes later, and Holmes was already scanning his files, rifling through letters, clippings, notes. He paused only to scrawl new observations in the margins of the envelope Dawn had sent. The name, I said, watching him. Radley Dawn. It meant something to you. Holmes nodded. It wasn't until I saw the watermark in the letter. The initials R.D. It matches a signature I encountered 10 years ago, on a white paper given to a French diplomat, one that nearly caused the collapse of a trade agreement with India. He opened a folder and held up a sheet. R.D. Signed off as a cultural envoy on a falsified treaty. The real envoy disappeared within a week. His body was found in the Seine 3 months later, weighted with stones and wrapped in violin strings. A message, I murmured. Always, Holmes said. Dawn has been composing this for over a decade. This was not a crime ring. It was a thesis. There came a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression pale. A letter, Mr. Holmes. It was delivered by hand. Just now. No messenger stayed. Holmes took it from her, opened it, and read the brief contents aloud. The overture has begun. Tonight, 8 p.m. Queen's Hall. You'll hear the first note whether you attend or not. There was no signature. Holmes looked up. Queen's Hall, he said. It's been closed for renovations these last 3 weeks, but the name, it's a symbol. The venue for royal performances. A place of national pride. And if Dawn intends to strike there, he won't strike there, Holmes said. He wants us to believe he will, which means the true event happens elsewhere. But at the same time, he turned toward the desk, finger flying across a map of central London. We need to identify every major gathering at 8 o'clock tonight. Every hall, assembly, gallery, or club of note. Look for political meetings, trade conferences, embassies. I fetched the city bulletin while Holmes spread newspapers across the floor. The pageantry of deduction had fallen away. This was war work now, bare, urgent, methodical. And somewhere behind it all, Dawn was smiling in the dark, waiting for the cue that would start the final movement. The final hours before dusk passed in a blur of maps, newspaper bulletins, and messages sent by swift cab. Holmes, possessed by a rare and icy clarity, sifted through every corner of London's evening agenda, parsing it not by official relevance, but by symbolic value. Queen's Hall, he'd insisted, was a decoy. Too grand, too expected. Radley Dawn had left his final note there as a diversion, a deliberate crescendo designed to draw every constable and agent into a single echo chamber while the real orchestration played elsewhere. I watched him work. Quiet, still, but burning beneath the surface. He was not merely racing time, he was matching intellect with a man who had written the rules of this twisted composition long before any of us had read the first measure. It was nearly 7 when Holmes froze, one hand hovering above a column in the Evening Standard. "There," he said softly. I moved to his side and read the notice. The Britannic Society for Industrial Harmony. Annual Symposium, 8 p.m., Dominion Building, Ludgate Hill. Private event. Attendees include leading arms merchants, international financiers, and trade representatives from 3 embassies. Industrial harmony, I repeated. Sounds like a trade summit. Holmes nodded, his voice low. And also a contradiction in terms. Ludgate Hill is barely half a mile from Queen's Hall, the perfect auditory distraction if one needed to mask the sound of something far more explosive. You think Dawn intends to target this event? I think he already has, Holmes said. And whatever he's planned will begin promptly at 8, under the cover of a concert no one will attend. Within minutes, we were in a cab, speeding through the narrowing streets as evening settled like ash over the city. Holmes was unusually quiet beside me, save for the single time he spoke, almost to himself. It's not just about disruption, it's about spectacle. Dawn doesn't believe in crimes. He believes in revelations. We arrived at the Dominion Building just past 7:45. It stood broad and dignified, a Romanesque monolith of arches and marble, its polished stone now bathed in gaslight. 2 doormen stood at the entrance, checking invitations with methodical precision. Holmes brushed past them with such authority they didn't think to stop us. We made our way up the grand staircase, following the hum of conversation and the warm clink of glasses. Inside, the hall was already half full. Men in black coats and high collars, women with gloved hands and jewel-toned dresses. A string quartet played a soft, unobtrusive background melody in one corner. Waiters moved like clockwork through the crowd, and at the center of it all, beneath the great brass chandelier, stood a man with a champagne flute in one hand and a pocket watch in the other. Radley Dawn. Holmes didn't slow. Dawn looked up and saw us. For a moment, there was no fear in his expression, only something that might have been respect. "You're early," he said. "You're predictable," Holmes replied. At that moment, the first of the waiters began pouring champagne from a crystal decanter into the guests' flutes. Holmes seized the bottle mid-air. "Don't drink," he barked. The crowd stilled. Holmes turned to Dawn. "It's not poison. That would be crude. You're not a murderer. You're a message writer." He lifted the bottle to the light. The glass was lined with a faint iridescence. "Volatile compound," he said, "not lethal until catalyzed. Likely to react when exposed to sudden heat or vibration." "Such as?" I murmured, the low-frequency hum of a nearby concert. Holmes nodded. "Or a bell toll." Dawn exhaled, almost admiringly. "And yet, no one will believe you. No evidence, no casualties." "There will be," Holmes said, "unless I end it now." He turned the bottle, unscrewed the cap, and slowly poured it into a potted plant by the wall. Then he handed the empty vessel to a nearby constable who had just entered at Lestrade's signal. "Search the building," Holmes said. "You'll find the rest of the compound stored near the heating ducts." Lestrade emerged from the stairwell seconds later, followed by 3 plainclothes officers. Dawn did not struggle. He merely adjusted his cuff and smiled faintly at Holmes. "Well played?" "Not a game," Holmes said. Dawn shrugged. "History will decide that." He was led away in silence. The event was quietly dispersed, the guests informed of a security concern, nothing more. No headlines followed. No panic. Scotland Yard chose discretion over spectacle, as Holmes advised. The poisons were confiscated, the instruments of the plot sealed and studied. The foreign representatives were questioned and quietly escorted out of the country, lest a scandal spark something larger than truth. Back at Baker Street, Holmes removed his coat slowly and sat down with the weariness of a man who had stared into something far deeper than mere crime. "Will it stop now?" I asked him quietly. He didn't answer right away. He simply opened his violin case, tuned the strings, and played. Softly, a slow and halting melody that I recognized only after the second refrain. Charlotte's ciphered composition, the unfinished one. Except now Holmes played the missing notes, the ones she hadn't written. When he finished, the last vibration, fading into the firelight, he spoke. "It will not stop, Watson. Because the dawn mind does not die with dawn, but for tonight we have preserved silence, and silence in the hands of evil men is power, but in the hands of good men." He looked at me. "It is peace." We sat there, the two of us, the city breathing gently beyond the fogged window, and for once, no one moved the pieces on the board. Not that night, and not until the next performance began. 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 Performance began.